So what we're talking about is gesture, structure, and movement, right? The kind of three basic principles. And when we're talking about gesture, the first thing we're talking about is how it is that we're relating the major masses to each other. So how it is that we can arrange these kind of, rectilinear forms, or however you want to establish the major masses, and then how it is that you're going to create like kind of gestural relationships between those, so that you can get something like a sense of the figure in space, and make it, feel balanced, feel like it's living in space, feel like it's acting or doing something, right? That it's posed. So that's the first kind of gesture that we're talking about. The second kind of gesture, so this is number one, which is the relationship of major masses, right? The RMM, which is not a thing that anybody would ever call the relationship of major masses, but the RMM. The second thing is an abstract principle, right? Which is the what some people call cascading ellipses, right? So cascading ellipses look like this. And, if we break down, like, for instance, like the profile view of a figure, it ends up looking, if you combine the head and the neck into one kind of ellipse, and then the back, and then the butt, and then the front of the knee, and then the calf, and then the front of the foot down into the foot, you get something like a figure, right? So that this echoes the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, kind of rhythm of the cascading ellipses. And that rhythm, that design principle does a lot to govern your kind of like mentality as you look at and observe a figure and try to figure out what to draw in order to represent what you're seeing, right? Which is, I want to really put a fine point on that, which is, like I said, what it is that you would choose to draw to represent what it is that you're seeing, right? I didn't say like, how do you copy what you see, right? Which is a totally different mode. And that mode might, fall a little bit more closer under classical anatomical drawing or fine arts drawing or something like that. How do you just respond to the visualization of what you're seeing? How does your body react to, the imagery that you're processing through your eyes, blah, blah, blah. So that stuff is really relevant, but it's not exactly what we're talking about, right? What we're talking about is like, how do you conceptualize, how do you conceive the complicated thing in front of you that you're seeing, and then how do you then choose to represent that in the myriad of ways that you could, right? So we talked a lot about this stuff last week, right? We talked about the major masses and the sort of what's called the box method, right? And the box method is a tough one. Oops, that's not how you spell method. The box method is a tough one because it seems simple, but if you don't put the requisite amount of time into understanding what it is, what it represents when you draw a box, and how to kind of carve into it, carve out of it, and how to even perceive it, it can be just kind of eternally confusing, right? So, the box method takes a while to figure out how to use. It's something that you can understand how to approach really quickly, but it's not something that you can figure out how to use functionally very quickly at all. It takes a while, it takes a lot of proportional understanding, a lot of gestural understanding to try to like figure that out, right? And so what I'm trying to do is trying to create a relationship, trying to create a transition from what we think of as like fine arts practice, observational drawing, what it is that we get out of drawing from the model, and then what it is that we want out of our own drawings in terms of like an illustrative product, right? Like how do we want our drawings to look, and how do we meet those goals in terms of just gesture, structure, and movement, right? So the reason that I start the reason that I start with the box method, right, because that's what we started talking about last week, is important, right? Because there's a couple other things that we're going to discuss, including this concept being really important pretty soon. But we're not going to get to this and really focus on this. We'll mention it a lot this kind of lesson in this drawing session, but we're not going to focus on it as like a technique necessarily until next class, right? And next class is where we're going to kind of strip down the process of drawing a figure to just like kind of center lines and rhythms like this, and try to understand how it is that the figure exists within this kind of conceptual framework. What we're going to do today is try to build a bridge between the box method, which can look and be kind of clunky, and what I'm going to call like the pillow technique, right? Which is how to visualize the body basically as a pillow that's either, kind of flexed backwards or crunched forward. So just to draw that in space real quick, I tend to sort of cartoon it like this, right? And a pillow kind of looks like that, right? And that pillow has, just like anything does, a center line. And so if that pillow were, for instance, crunched up against a wall instead, it might look something like this, right? And there might be some little kind of shorthand ways that I have to draw like the kind of creases in it and make this thing look like a kind of pillow that's crunched up against the wall, right? So something like that might look like a sitting figure. Something like this might look like a standing figure, right? And if we sort of carve into this a bit and give it a neck and give it some arms and give it a crotch and some legs, it becomes a figure pretty fast, right? Like it really does become a good stand-in for how to build out a figure. And so if we can combine, now the reason I don't teach this right away, even though this is kind of a niftier trick than the box method, is because the center lines and how it is that you draw these kind of creases and folds and stuff like that, how it is that you visualize that kind of stuff happening, is really dependent on your ability to see volume in space. And if you can't properly visualize the center line of your figure, then you're not going to have much success with any of these. And the reason that the box method helps so much to help visualize the center is because it right away, unlike like for instance an egg or something like that, where if you put a center line there, or if you put a center line here or a center line there, something like that, you might be able to move forward with that kind of drawing easily enough, but it might not allow you to progress all the way to your goals, right? You might not be able to like kind of tighten up and structure up that drawing enough to really be like convincing in space, because if your center line's off, then your whole thing is off, right? So what the box method does is, however that box is oriented, it automatically gives you a front and a side, right? So it automatically gives you this, right? And the important thing about that is that when you think of like where the center is, right, it automatically adds this extra little bit here, right? So it automatically says to you, well, if I'm going to draw a center line here, I've got to be dividing this shape, right? And you're not dividing this whole shape. So here in the egg, there's not such an obvious edge, right? So when you put the center line, a lot of people misplace it, just accidentally, because they're not considering, well, what's the side edge of the egg, right? So if I draw an egg like this, but it's actually a face, well, that face has like a side plane. So maybe the center of that face should be like over here, right? Does that make sense? But you don't see a sort of egg that way, right? So even though you might see a face that way, and if I draw a face like a little bit more convincingly, it would look something, like this, right? As the side plane, and then you would have a nose like that, right? So the center plane would be running through there, and, that would be pretty much easier to visualize as a face. But what I'm saying is, like, if you're not automatically thinking of this as, let me just close the door real quick. Sorry. If you're not automatically thinking of that as a way to divide up the front and side planes and a way to identify the center line then you're really not going to get to structure very quick, right? And you're not going to be able to progress your drawing very well, because without structure and without centerline and stuff like that, you're just not really going to be able to go as far as you might like in terms of how to build out a figure, right? So you'll have to stop at a certain point of like cartooning and of symbolism, because you won't be able to build the structure in, because you don't have the center line and you don't have the volumetric nature of the simple forms. Does that make sense? Right? So the box method is really important even before we get to the pillow method, because we need to be able to see where the front and side plane of something like the pillow is, right? Even though, and you can see I already drew it here, even though, the pillow doesn't have as obvious of a front and side plane, but neither does the body, right? So the pillow does a lot better of a job of anticipating the body, of sort of giving you a usable shape. And, if we just break it down into like kind of oversimplified, gender type, like, how do you draw a man versus how do you draw a woman? It's like, well, you can just make your pillow like a little bit more bottom heavy for the typical female, and you can make it a little bit more top heavy for the typical male body, in order to devise a sort of way to understand like that kind of anatomical difference, right? And both have a center line and both have room for the neck, right? And one just, appears more feminine than the other, and one appears more masculine than the other, right? So we can use the pillows in that way. And obviously, like, pillows don't have pectoralis or abdomens, but they do actually bulge and crunch in a lot of the same ways. And, part of the conceptual nature, both of gesture, structure, and movement, is the concept of crunch and stretch, right? And crunch and stretch is not, it's not like, it doesn't show up as much in illustration books, fine arts books, and classical anatomy books as a concept as it does specifically in animation, right? Like in animation, they really, really focus on crunch and stretch and things like that in order to get things feeling like they're moving. So the basic concept of crunch and stretch, in a way, like I think in really basic like 2D animation, the first thing you do is you teach, anticipation of movement and how to make a ball bounce, right? And so when the ball, is coming down to the ground, it's sort of looking like this, and it's getting like more and more oblong until it hits the ground. And when it hits the ground, suddenly it becomes oblong in the other way, and then it becomes even more oblong until it starts to rebound, right? And then it's going to become less oblong and start to head off like sort of in the other direction, and after it recovers. So the ball itself, what we think of as a ball, is only really a ball in the sort of movement cycle for a little bit. Other than that, it's always kind of like stretching and reaching towards its destination, being affected by gravity or being affected by impact, right? And so the other way we think about that in terms of figure drawing is like, well, what are the major masses doing, right? So if we think of the box method like this, and we think of like a nice contrapposto pose like that, with the stand leg here, right? Something like that. And then the other leg here, something like that, right? So you have a center line, and you have our external oblique here crunching and our external oblique there stretching, right? So this is crunching and this one is stretching. And this is normally, kind of illustrated with a C shape or an S shape, right? So the S shape is sort of for stretch and the C shape is sort of for crunch, right? And so that those two things together sort of describe how it works when the rib cage and the pelvis are not aligned with each other, right? And so that kind of crunch and stretch also precipitates, the offset ellipses, right? So something like this, could kind of be drawn with a crunch and a stretch like that, right? So it's like on this side it's crunching and on this side it's stretching. So so this kind of concept is really crucial to us, and it's pretty easy to start cartooning it. But we want to see why that matters, and how it is that we'll relate that to volumes, and how it is that we'll relate that to anatomy. Because right now, how I've drawn it is just to do with the contours, right? I've not drawn too, like these are like not really super structural. And when I describe it over here, it's just a contour box and another contour box, and then just describing the contours at the sides of it, right? So I'm not showing you really like volumetrically how it's working. So I want to give you an example of how this works. And so I brought up the Instagram page of Jamie Sloan, who I just saw this like kind of randomly this morning. So here's like a little video of one of her sculptures. And it looks like this. Right, so obviously a hand. Actually, I didn't realize how sexual that was until just now. Sorry about that. but I think that's sexual, right? But anyway, looking at the hand and the pinky, most importantly, right? I think that, for me, the most exciting part of this sculpture, where it is now in this, like obviously it's not finished, I don't think, but in this stage, is where that pinky kind of jumps up, and where that big folds over the pinky, right? So that big fold is representative of a lot of action, right? Like that's like the pinky is impacting the volume of the palm in a really major way, right? So I kind of think of that as like, when I'm drawing, I think of that as if somebody took the pinky, like as if it were a piece of wood, and jammed it into the palm of the hand. And when they jammed it in, it caused a kind of ripple effect, right? And that's action. That's one form impacting another. And that's where all the money is in a drawing, right? It's like, that's the gesture. That's the relationship, right? Is where you can draw and illustrate action like that. So you can see that in the rest of the rest of the fingers are not as exciting, right? Like, I think that's fair to say. And also this part over here, I mean, I think it's not done, right? And I think they'll get more exciting. But like this part over here always has a lot of action. There's always a lot of forms interacting, where the thumb and the forefinger and the web in between all interact, right? There's a lot going on there in terms of one form impacting another or wrapping around another. And that's just not been illustrated yet, right? It's just not been got to yet. But you can see how like the interest isn't there yet. The action's not there yet. So, or we can look at another one of her sculptures, which I think is a bit more, like this one, right? Which I think is like a bit more finished. And if we look at this, like for instance, in relationship to what we were talking about here, right? It's like, if we look at, for instance, like let's say this foot here, this foot has, some of that pillow shape to it, right? It's like, it's kind of a bent form like this, and there's an ankle like that, and then there's a heel like that, right? So that's the basic kind of build up here. The ankle bone is there. And then you have this transition, like, so this 1, 2, 3, and that would be the crunch and the stretch on one side. And you can see the crunch happening because there's little crunch marks there, isn't there, right? And so there's a lot of action there because it's like stretch and crunch, S and C, right? And then we have another really nice crunch here. And this one doesn't happen so simply because there's kind of a down and an up, and it comes up over the big toe. And the big toe is really impacting, right, in like this direction, right? So it's really, really impacting in this direction, the form and the volume of the foot, right? And you can see that impact happening, like that kind of rippling effect happening on the structure of the foot, right? So there's a lot of action in these toes, isn't there? And it's a pretty cool drawing because you get a kind of, it's a pretty cool sculpture because even in this picture, you get a kind of like an illustration of how to draw that action, right? And this is not just how feet work. Like a lot of things work. Like pillows work like this. Like bellies work like this. Like you could see how, for instance, here, like you could see how this could also be like a crotch, right? You could see how that foot from the front view has a kind of volume like this, right? And then it has a kind of volume like that. And then you have a big toe coming out over here and a little toe coming out over there. And if you just kind of like modify that and call that a crotch, and then you get some of that wrinkle action in there like that. Hold on, let me get rid of this ruler here because that's dragging my, you get some of that crunching there. And then it's like, okay, like, well, when you want to put in like a leg that's raised up like this, or a leg that's raised up like that, well, you kind of know how to draw that crunching action. And then here would be the belly, and then there would be the belly button, and then, blah, 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 right? So it's a lot of the same stuff. It's just that here it happens to be like a foot body instead of a body, and a toe instead of a leg. But it's still a cylindrical form impacting like an overall major mass. Does that make sense? So what you got to do is you got to figure out how to draw the thing impacting the thing, right? So let's see that in action here in like Bernini, right? So this is Bernini's, it's called The Rape of Proserpina, which is in the Villa Borghese in Rome, I think. And I've seen, so Bernini, Ratto di Proserpina, The Rape of Proserpina, marble sculpture, and Villa Borghese in Rome. So this is kind of what it looks like. It's a quite dramatic sculpture. But one really famous moment on it is where the hand here sits in and kind of impacts the thigh, right? And so the beautiful naturalism of Bernini's carving shows up in how both of those hands are just like squeezing into the flesh, right? Really famous moment, right? And so there's a lot of action there because the fingers as firm cylindrical forms are impacting the softness of the cylindrical forms of the thigh, right? And that's what makes this thing so excitingly naturalistic, is not that it's actually that realistic of a sculpture, but that the forms that are there are clear. And then those clear forms impact other clear forms, right? And show the softness. And that's why people say something like, my goodness, how does Bernini make his flesh appear so soft in a material like marble? And it's like, well, only things like balloons can be impacted by fingers like that, right? So then all of a sudden marble feels like a balloon. Now let's see like another example of a Bernini sculpture. Here's another view of it there. And you can find like really good photographs of this if you Google the image. But here's another sculpture, right? Apollo and Daphne. And here's another hand. And that hand you can see does not have the action of the previous sculpture, right? This hand is just kind of like sitting on top, right? And because of that, it doesn't have that same feeling. Now, the sculpture is still nice. It's not like the sculpture is somehow worse or better. That's not what I'm trying to say. I'm just saying that there's not as much action in that hand in that moment, right? Because it's not digging in. So what I do when I'm thinking about drawing is I always think of like, the Incredible Hulk, right? And there's always this joke in comics, like when the comic writers wanted to be like a little bit funny, they would show a moment where the superheroes, definitely the Incredible Hulk being one of them, would try to do something pedestrian, right? They would try to like call for a pizza. And because they were so strong, they would accidentally like destroy the phone with their massive finger, right? And so I try to think of moments in my drawing like that. Like if the model's hand is on the ground and I really want to show the weight there, how do I push that hand and show the impact and the weight of that hand on the surface that it's touching, right? And of course you can't do that if the surface is rigid, right? So we have like a model stand and the model put his hand on it, and it wouldn't be it wouldn't make a lot of sense to draw the hand impacting the model stand, like digging into the model stand, right? But it would make sense to draw the model stand impacting the hand, Because in that case, it's the hand that's the soft thing and the model stand that's the hard thing. So the more that you crunch the bottom of your hand and the more that you show that that form should be voluminous but is in fact flattening, right? And that it's bulging in an area, right? Because you have like muscle and fat on the palm of your hand. When you put that down, it'll bulge if something pushes up against it. So the more weight you push down, the more that that form bulges. So if you can illustrate that, then you can illustrate the action of the weight of the thing. You know, this is really important, right? So when we come back to our, let's say our major masses here, when we come back to our major masses, one of the things that I want to describe is the weight of the rib cage versus the upthrust of the pelvis, right? Because the way that I think of the pelvis is kind of like a bucket like this, right? With some leg holes, right? And maybe this should be, right? So maybe something like that, and then something like this, and you know, then legs can come out of that, right? And you have a butt and a crotch, right? So something like that, and this is really simplified. This is not really how I draw the pelvic block, but when I think of the rib cage, let's say, as like an egg shape, I really want to think of this as having weight. And so I want to think of this as like, you know, it's got an abdomen, and then that whole thing is sitting in this pelvic block, right? Which looks something like this. And it's going to be impacting that, or I should say more like the pelvic block is going to be impacting the soft forms of the external oblique, the abdomen, and the erector spinae in the back, right? So it's kind of like, how can I draw this in a way that shows clearly that the weight of the rib cage is sort of pushing down and into the shape of the pelvic block, right? How can you draw it in a way that shows that impact? Right? So that there's really like a clear sense of weight there, right? That something is happening, right? And so especially when someone is sitting, right? When we have someone seated like this, you know, we have a great deal of impact of the weight of the rib cage on the weight of the pelvic block, right? And so when we start to figure out, okay, like how do these forms work, right? How do we kind of mannequinize this and turn this into simple shapes and stuff like that? Well, we have this kind of, you know, belly to worry about here and how that's going to be impacted. And then we have this, you know, chest coming. And this starts to look very much like a pillow and starts to look very much like, you know, having the concepts of crunch and stretch, right? Crunch here and stretch there. And we start to figure out that shape in a way that has all of those principles kind of working for it, right? The volume, the gesture, and the movement, right? And so what we have in movement is we have weight. What we have in structure is we have front and side planes and simple volumetrics, right? And we can start to break this down and kind of anatomically understand it so that it starts to work as a figure, right? One of the things I wanted to mention was that a really useful just kind of shape that I kind of learned has to do with if the figure is twisting quite a bit, right? So if we kind of visualize the rib cage form like this, and then let's say the pelvic form even like that, right? Like there's quite a bit of twisting where we would see the back. So the rib cage would be like this, and then this would be the front, and then the back would be almost twisting like that, right? So this would be side plane like that. So when we visualize that, a useful way just to kind of see that is to be able to draw a shape that's kind of like this. right? Like just being able to draw a twisted shape like that, right? That's a rectilinear form, and that goes from, seeing side on this side to seeing side on that side. And if you can divide that up into like a rib cage and a pelvic form, then you can see how that can give you like a lot of action in a gesture. So it can be as simple as just going from side view to, sorry, I don't like that. So from like a simple side view to having more than side view, right? So to having something like that, or to having like a little bit of front view, right? So it looks something like this. And of course, like this is just another shape that you have to do a lot of modification to, right? You have to figure out what you're drawing. You have to figure out like what's butt, what's rib cage, what angles are useful to put there, what angles are useful to put here, how to fit a neck onto this thing so that the neck is at the right angle, where to put shoulder blades and how to stick an arm on that, right? Like all of this ends up needing a lot of modification to sort of understand and to use. But it's a useful kind of shape to start with and to conceptualize like a twisted pose, right? When a model is rotating in space. So that shape, being able to draw that kind of like a big chunk of clay and you just twist it, right? Or you turn it or you bend it. That's a really useful one, right? Just being able to kind of twist that thing, right? As much as you kind of want to, right? So being able to draw those rib cage and that pelvis together, and then divide that up into like what's a collarbone, what's a crotch, where's the circle for the neck, where does the head go, right? Like all this kind of stuff, so that you can start to, draw and fill out that figure a little bit more, right? So that's a really useful shape. Now, if we go over to here, let's just talk about a couple other shapes. So here you see, instead of a blocky shape like this, we see Andrew Loomis's what he's calling the mannequin frame, right? And you see that he's got like a really round version of the rib cage. It's barely even egg shaped. It's more of a circle, right? And so you see he's got a little V shape in there to fit the neck, right? So he's sort of cut a V shape into it to make sure that the pit of the neck is where it wants to be. And then he draws like a double line down like this to represent the sternum. And then he draws a line kind of like this and like this to represent the thoracic arch, right? The arc of the ribs. And he turns that into a volume pretty nicely, like you can see over here in the side view. He shows you what it looks like in the side view, and it's quite different than you might have thought, since it was just represented as like a ball here. But in the side view, it's not that, right? It's represented something more like this, and he's kind of drawn an open arc like that for the thoracic arch, and then a big up ramp like this for the sternum, and then an angle for the neck to insert, and then an area for the scapula in the back, right? So he's got a pretty clever little approach here, and even more clever, I think, are his two discs at the bottom here in the side view, just looking like a circle, but in the front view looking like two symbols about to crash together, right? Two symbols like that about to kind of crash together. That's a really nice pelvic shape. And if we just investigate that a little further, where did that go? Uh-oh, I made a mistake. Okay. If we just investigate that a little further, here you see he's just creating poses with it, right? So he's got a couple of different ways to draw it, ways to visualize it when it turns in space, right? Here, Loomis, not here, here, you see that he started to kind of articulate two shapes that are working in concert with each other, and that's this kind of rib cage shape that we have over here. So for instance, like let's say in this 3/4 view, we see really clearly that rib cage shape kind of existing here with that V shape cut out of it. but he's kind of draped over this chest shape, right? And he's turned it into this kind of cape that sits on top of this egg shape and creates for us the kind of plane of the shoulders, the plane of the chest, and also the roundness of the trapezius in the back, right? So that we can insert the neck right into there. So he's got this kind of shape that just sits on top and helps us kind of visualize how it is that the pectoralis relates to volumetrically the rib cage, right? And he uses the same center line for it, right? But you can see from the back he's sort of added, some indication for the shoulder blade, and then for the transition into the erector spinae and the latissimus dorsi that come down. So here he drags that cape down all the way down into the sacrum. In the front view, it sort of stops at the chest, right? And so this is really useful. This is a useful thing to kind of get a hold of and to be able to see when you're looking at the figure up on the figure model stand. Now, we can see this also, here is it kind of articulated from different views. So that's nice to see and to kind of copy and understand. We can also see this show up in an anatomy text like Stephen Roger Peck, right? So here's Peck describing just the basic proportion in his sketch pages of the rib cage, and you can see here he's drawing it more of like an egg shape than Loomis drew it in his version. But you can see it's still divided and it still has the thoracic arch. Now, if we go down a little bit, we see how it is that he really conceptualizes this. And this is where, if you look at Loomis's drawing and then you look at this little sequence here, you really see how Loomis kind of put together. Now, I don't know that Loomis looked at this or didn't look at this or whatever. That's not really my concern. I don't know who predates what, or if both of them are just copying someone else. That's not really my concern. It's just a different way to kind of visualize it. So you see over here, Peck, like many people, are visualizing the trajectory of the collarbone from the center point as like a Cupid's bow arrow, right? Or a Cupid's bow, rather. So that isn't represented here, right? That's just kind of glossed over here in an effort to just make the overall volumes as clear as possible. So now, if you look at the way the shoulders are here, they're still kind of roundy, right? They're not very planar. So there's a lot of questions there about how you might render them or whatever. So if you go to Michael Hampton, you can see Michael Hampton is devising kind of a separate strategy, which is to, instead of put this kind of cape drape over it, he's built this kind of like architectural block that does pretty well to describe the down plane of the front of the shoulders and the way that the shoulders actually sit forward and project forward from the thrust of the rib cage, right? So this is a different way to visualize it. All of them have their advantages and then have their problems, right? All of them need to be carved into or adjusted or reconsidered or whatever. But they all also have their advantages in ways to visualize. And they all might be more or less useful from different angles of drawing, right? Like it might be really useful if you're trying to like pick out one view, whereas like, from a top view, it might be like perfectly useful to use something like this. Whereas from a bottom view, it might not be as useful. I don't know. That's kind of up to you to pick and choose, to learn these things, to put them into action when the model's there, and then to decide which one is going to help you the most in whatever drawing you make. So when we're looking at a pillow shape, right? When we're looking at a pillow shape, whether that pillow shape is like this, right? Like a kind of excited, proud one that's standing, that's kind of representing the forward thrust of the rib cage, and then the backwards thrust of the pelvis. Right, so whether we've got that and then this going on, so that this would be an up plane and this would be something like a down plane, right? So we would have a little bit of a shadow there. We would know where our belly button goes, and then up here we would have a little bit of an up plane, right? And there'd be more light on that. So whether it's like that or whether it's like this, right? Like showing that bent over form, or depending on how you want to look at it, maybe this is looking at the figure from the back, but we'll draw it from the front, like in a kind of seated position, hunched over. Right? So however you want to draw that pelvic block, right? We got to figure out the gesture of it, and then the pillow shape that we're investigating today should have a like representation of that going on, right? And so, like I said before, the pillow shape brings us a little bit more immediately to something that feels like the figure, right? To something that feels like a stand-in for the figure, whereas the blocks really don't, right? You have to really draw over them and erase out a lot of parts and stuff like that. But one of the tricky things, like this is a good example here about the blocks, and especially about the pillow shape, is like, well, you know, what happens when you really want to dial in a rib cage, or how do you understand that? So it's important, like we discussed last time, to know what it is that you're trying to represent when you represent a rib cage block. So one of the nice things about like a rib cage block or a pelvic block, for instance, is that even though it doesn't do a perfect job of representing the rib cage itself, right? Because a rib cage itself, you would have to kind of find the rib cage within that, right? So you'd have to dimensionalize this, find the 7 cervical vertebrae, find the pit of the neck, find the center line, carve out the thoracic arch here, carve out the shape of the rib cage coming up to the first rib there, and then reaching back to the 7 cervical vertebrae, and then finding that shape like within the overall volume of that that block, right? So now the convenient thing about the block is that while you have to kind of know about all this, and while you have to visualize all this, well, the clavicles do kind of reach out here, and the clavicles do kind of reach out there. So it's like, do you really have to carve all that stuff away, or can you just draw a block and kind of leave that as a marker for where the arms might be, and then just kind of draw the arms from that point out? So it's like, do you erase the box or do you keep the box? And the question is, well, what does it stand for, right? Like, how does it work? So So one of the things about the block, though, is that if you do that, if you start to visualize like the entirety of the shoulders and the shoulder girdle and the trapezius and all that kind of stuff as just the block that you're drawing, that block is going to get like a little upright, right? That block is going to start looking like this. But the rib cage itself is going to be like another block sort of inside of that is at a little bit more, especially at the top, of like an angle, and maybe is operating a little bit more like this, right? So there's kind of like two rib cages, two boxy forms going on at the same time. One would be like the kind of shoulder box that's kind of sitting outside of it. That might be more like the overall torso. And the other one might be the rib cage that's kind of projecting forward. And you'd see that they would have two separate center lines that wouldn't be exactly the same. And that's often the case, that the center line of, like, let's say the chest, for instance, isn't the same as the center line of the rib cage, nor is it the same as the center line for the gesture of the belly, where the belly button sits, et cetera, right? Like you have to kind of like navigate and figure all that stuff out so that what you're drawing, represents what it is that you want to show. So the pillow, you have to visualize all this stuff. You still have to be seeing a proper rib cage. You still have to be practicing how it is that a proper rib cage sits within an overall form, right? Because especially something like this over here, how does the rib cage sit in that? Well, it's still thrust forward compared to the overall form, right? So it still is going to be looking something like this, right? Even though the overall form is sort of back this way, right? So you have to be able to visualize that rib cage so that you can see it, so that you can attach things like the belly button and figure out where all this stuff kind of goes and works, so that you can, draw the drawing that you want to draw. right? And these can represent the shoulders quite nicely as long as you see the difference between what is rib cage and what is conceptual form, right? So we'll go here and just take a look, and so this bit here, it's a conversation coming from what I call the arrow abstraction, which is a way to sort of draw a center line that helps you build out the volumes in relationship to the contours. So we'll revisit this next week when we're talking about the arrow abstraction. But what we're looking at here is how these center lines operate like as they move around a form. So here we have just these basic like kind of casts of mouths, and you can see that the center line does a lot to reinforce the form when it's there. Like you can really see how that form moves in space when you have that center line kind of traced along it, right? And when the thing is facing directly at you, like it is here, it's harder to see the volume in that, right? It's easier with a 3/4 view. And same thing for the ball. If that ball were facing you perfectly, then it would just be a straight line up and down. So here we have some pillows, and I've sort of related them to like center line action that's pretty common in the body, which would be like the rhythm of the sternum, the transition of the upper abdomen, and then the lower abdomen, right? And so here it's kind of an S shape when that form is twisting. Here it's kind of a reverse S shape. Here it's kind of a C shape, right? And of course these creasings go across it, right? Just like the creases in a belly would go. But here it is. I tried to relate this as clearly as possible to these figure drawings that I made, which were done off of some reference photos. And so here I've just traced out like the center line of the neck, the path of the clavicles, the center line of the chest as it runs down into the abdomen and down into the pelvis, and then the line of the crotch or the inguinal ligament, or whatever you want to call it, or however you want to conceptualize it. So I've done that in each of these, and then I've tried to make a pillow that kind of does the same thing. I've tried to pose the pillow with like some lighting that helps. And you can see how, like here in the pillow, for instance, there seems to be like a place for the neck. Doesn't it seem like that's a good spot where a neck would plug like right in, right? And then it seems to sort of extend in the abdomen and then tuck down towards the crotch. And these little crease marks here on either side, they sure do seem like the inguinal ligament, reaching down towards the pubic symphysis, right? So they seem like this line here coming down towards the pubic symphysis. And then these guys over here, see this nice way that it sort of tucks in there, right? See that little C shape that wraps around? I mean, that's such a nice way to kind of describe what's going on here in the external oblique. Or here you can see again the kind of S shape of the external oblique as it's stretching on one side, and the C shape of the external oblique as it's crunching on the other. Crunch on this side, stretch on the other. Now, these folds are not perfectly anatomical, right? Like they're not exactly in the right spot for how a person's belly would work if they were in that pose, but they sure are close, and they sure do pass for a kind of human look, right? So it's like if you can draw this, then you can draw that. It's pretty much the same anatomy. You just have to like be a little more mindful of the proportion, basically. So same thing here, just kind of casual pose, but you can see how the light hits right there. You can see right where the belly button would go. You see right where the neck inserts, right? You can see it so well, right? It's really clear. So same thing here. You can almost see the line for the rib cage, right? You can almost see the line and the insertion of the upper abdomen into the rib cage, right? It looks very kind of realistic in a way, right? It's right there as like a real rib cage, right? And you can plug a neck right in there and put a head on top, and look at all these great folds going on here, right? So, this is a great way to sort of understand how to figure out the figure in space. Here we have examples, and this is a great exercise to do. I just borrowed these from Will Weston. Now, Will Weston has a great Instagram and Facebook page where he goes over his demos and things like that. There's a lot to learn there, in addition to, classes like this. And this is his students' assignments where he just gives them, like 50 pillows to draw or something like that. So you just pick a pillow and draw it 50 times and try to get it to be as human as possible. And I think you can see, even in these small little examples, how human they get, right? How gestural they look, right? And that's because, partially because that's the way they look, and partially because that's what the artist is emphasizing, and it's working really well. So definitely go check out Will Weston's page. It's really, really good. It's got lots of just diagrammatical drawings and how it is that he breaks down the figure. It's really, really useful page. He's really great artist. So we'll stop there and we'll talk more about this stuff in another class. But what we'll start doing is by doing some pillow sketches, right? And there's one thing that I just want to mention real quick before we start drawing, which is just the difference between form and like symbolism, right? And so when we do something like this, like let's say we draw a pillow like that, right? Right, something like that. And we just kind of go like that, right? So that's a very symbolic representation, right? And it works really well. Like, even if we have, for instance, like a finger like this, right? And we can put like a knuckle on it like that, and another knuckle there, and just a fingernail there, and it that works to call it a finger, right? So this kind of symbolism works really well, but it does become confusing. It's like, okay, well, if I wanted to like render this out, how exactly does that work? And where does this end and where does this start? So it's not quite as clear as, working out how it is that these shapes are going to interact, and if what kind of crunch and what kind of stretch is going on, and if if forms like this are kind of like wrapping around, or if they're branching off at some point, like how it is that these shapes are interacting with the rest of the pillow form. Right. So being able to kind of like describe those folds a little bit more thoroughly can be really helpful, because you want to be able to draw the kind of action that's happening there. Right. So the more that you can illustrate like a clear volume, like, okay, this has a turning point there. Right. So part of your job is to kind of, come in here and look to be a little bit more volumetric in how it is that you describe things, so that it's not so ambiguous to you what the shape is. And it doesn't mean that everything gets traced, right? It doesn't mean that everything has a line around it. Some things taper off, some things don't have clear edges, whatever. But you want to be able to be as volumetric as possible, so that you can apply like a sense of lighting or a sense of volume where you need to, when you start to kind of divide this up and turn it into a figure, right? So the first part that we'll do is we'll start out by just drawing some pillows, right? So I'll set some pillows up and we'll just light them and let them sit and let them look like people, and let you draw them like they are people. And then we'll have the model, Jack, come out, and we'll have you draw from the model, but looking for that pillow shape, right? Looking for that opportunity to like make one part of the pillow affect the other part of the pillow, affect the other part of the pillow, right? And create that kind of sequence of action where you ask yourself, well, what am I looking at? What is the thing that I'm looking at doing? What does it weigh? How are the major forms impacting each other, et cetera, et cetera? And you start to ask yourself those questions, and then you start to get answers, right? And so, part of it is like, well, how naturalistic are you trying to be? But in the amount of time that we'll have will be, let's say, like less naturalistic and more kind of expressive and cartoonist, right? So we can use some symbolisms, right? We don't have to render everything, but we want to be as volumetric as possible, right? So we'll start there with the pillows. We'll just make some pillow drawings in class. And I'll just set those up on the model stand, and then a little bit later we'll have Jack come out after we do a little bit. Okay, so that's basically the initial thrust of the conversation. Like I said, we'll discuss and visit the arrow abstractions next week, which is an even further reduced or as reductive a process as possible for visualizing the gesture of the figure.